We'll get underway. Good afternoon again, everybody. Welcome to Marquette University Law School, Eckstein Hall. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is On the Issues, our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people who are doing interesting and important work in this region and beyond. Today we are joined by Professor Patrick Sharkey. Professor Sharkey is an associate professor in sociology at NYU. He is the author of this book, which is an important book on inequality, a critically acclaimed book written several years ago. It's called Stuck in Place: Urban Neighborhoods and the End of Progress Toward Racial Equality. In the next hour, we're going to talk to Professor Sharkey about his research, his findings in this book. They're pretty interesting. But we're also going to spend part of this talking about his new area of research and his new focus, which is on violence and how high poverty communities have been affected by a decline in violence in many parts of America. Not so much in Milwaukee, but in many parts of America. We're going to be talking about all that and more. We'll leave some time for your questions. So let's begin by giving a warm welcome to Professor Patrick Sharkey. Thank you. So a couple of the reviews of this book described it as troubling, and yet it is not. I don't think it's a pessimistic book, because you do offer some food for thought, which we'll discuss at the end, for dealing with inequality. But I wanted to begin by something you say very early in the book, Professor Sharkey, and I'll see if I could say it correctly again. You said that the story of neighborhoods and race in America is one of enduring inherited inequality. It's a very strong statement. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Thanks for having me here. This is great to see so many folks out. This is exciting. What I meant was this. We've known for a while that urban poverty has become more concentrated. That's become a bigger problem over time. And we've known that because a lot of people have written about that over time. I think what hasn't been as clear, and what I found in the book, is that the same families have been in the poorest American neighborhoods over long periods of time and over multiple generations. And some people may have guessed that, but then you look at it in the data, and it's overwhelming how the degree to which this is true in the United States, particularly among African Americans. This is the most common experience among African Americans over the last 2 generations, has been to live in the poorest, most disadvantaged American neighborhoods, not at a single point in time, but over consecutive generations. And that came out in the data, and that kind of reoriented my thinking about urban poverty and urban inequality. It's about more than what we see out there right now. It's about a persistent level of disadvantage and a persistent level of inequality that has been passed on across generations. That's what I set out to explore, to figure out what the consequences of that persistent disadvantage are.
And there was this feeling back in the 60s, we have the civil rights movement, we move into the 70s, and certainly we had deep-rooted poverty in America. But I think the feeling was that somehow in the year 2015 or 2016, we'd be in a different place.
Yeah.
But we really are not in a terribly different place.
Right, yeah, so that's the subtitle is The End of Progress Toward Racial Equality, and that's a pessimistic subtitle, but again, it's based on the data. So in the 1960s, you can see the progress toward racial equality. This was a decade of major advances in civil rights, a decade where a large black middle class emerged for the first time in the US. And then that progress ended in 1970. And so I start the book with just some graphs making this clear that since 1970 there's been progress across some dimensions, across educational attainment. There's been a lot more progress. In terms of income and wealth, there's been no progress toward racial equality since 1970. So that's kind of the puzzle that motivated quite a bit of the book is, well, how do we explain this? How do we explain why all this progress stopped at the tail end of the 1960s when, as you say, there was a lot of hope that the children who grew up during that era would make more advancement, that the gap between black and white Americans would continue to shrink, and that hasn't happened. And so a lot of the explanation for this focus on characteristics of individuals or families or human capital, and that's certainly part of the story. But when I looked at inequalities in neighborhood conditions, that just stands out. In order to understand this, it became very clear that we have to look outside the family as well. We have to think about types of environments in which Black and white Americans have lived over the past 40 years.
I want to talk about the effects of what you refer to as the inherited ghetto, because they're very important for us to talk about. But I want to ask you one question about what happened. How did we reach this point? Why haven't we made progress? You talk about disinvestment in parts of our communities. Elaborate on that for us. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, again, so if you go back to, I didn't live through this, but I've read about it.
He's a young guy.
Anyone in the audience can correct me about the pieces I get wrong here, but you read these urban histories, and in the 1960s there were very passionate debates about how to deal with the emerging urban crisis that really kind of became visible in the 1960s. And there were two modes of thought here. One was that this was a problem derived from injustice and inequality. And then there was another mode of thought that this was a problem that really derived from lawlessness and disorder. And these were debates that kind of continued throughout the 1960s. That latter view, that the urban crisis is a function of lawlessness, is a function of disorder, that won out. And I don't want to state this too strongly because it's continued to be a debate. But that approach toward dealing with the problem of urban poverty as a problem of crime, violence, lawlessness, disorder, that began to manifest itself in federal policy in the 1970s. And the way that it took hold was that the federal government's commitment to cities started to shrink over time. The commitment to having a federal role in every city throughout the country, supporting cities as cities started to deal with worsening problems, that commitment started to shrink. And so a lot of what we see with the persistence of urban inequality is a function of the shrinking federal commitment to cities. And that's derived from a model of urban policy that really took hold in the 1970s. It hasn't changed all that much since then.
Let's talk about the impact of what you found on the kids who grow up in these disadvantaged communities. I mean, it's pretty interesting. It's everything from cognitive test scores to health issues to even the aspirations parents have for their kids as they grow up, their trajectories in life. Widespread consequences of growing up in this inherited ghetto.
Yeah, so there's something different about living in a very disadvantaged neighborhood, not only for a few years, but over multiple generations. And what it looks like, the evidence that I present in the book shows that multi-generational cumulative exposure to the most disadvantaged neighborhoods really has a different effect than exposure over a few years or even a single generation. So that if a kid is from, and everything that I've done here is to try to estimate the causal effect. So we're isolating out everything we can about characteristics of the families and the kids and really trying to identify just what is the effect if you have two identical kids, one is raised in a very poor neighborhood and the other is not. What does the trajectory of that kid look like compared to a kid who looks identical but is raised in a very different kind of neighborhood? And the impact, the cumulative impact of multi-generational exposure looks extremely severe. So, there's a lot of focus on kids' cognitive development, cognitive test scores, academic achievement. The impact of living in very poor neighborhoods over multiple generations reduces kids' performance. I don't want to get too technical here, but by roughly 2/3 of standard deviation, which is, if we think about a normal IQ scale, this is like the difference between being above average and average on an IQ scale. This is an enormous impact. And it derives, when I say neighborhood, that means a whole bunch of things that come wrapped up in where we live. That means going to a lower or higher quality school. That means being exposed to environmental toxins in the air, in the soil. So all this stuff, I'm not saying that schools don't matter. Schools are fundamental to this. But all of this comes bundled up in where we live. And that's what we're trying to isolate here. How does a residential environment around us, how has that perpetuated racial inequality in the U.S.?
It's interesting. I think in the book you talk about even the experiences of the African-American middle class and the white middle class are different. In what ways are they different?
Yeah, this is a finding that is surprising for me, really startling, but African American families in the middle class live in more disadvantaged neighborhoods than whites who are very poor. So there's something distinct about our neighborhoods across the U.S. that's different from income inequality, it's different from wealth inequality. When African American families move up in the income distribution, that doesn't translate into a more advantaged residential environment in the same way that it does particularly for whites in the U.S., okay? Does that make sense? So the advancement in income doesn't translate into an advantaged residential environment in the same way for different groups. And that's a function of persistent segregation. It's a function of the way we do urban housing policy. But the implication is that even middle-class African-American families live in more disadvantaged environments than very poor white families. So there's something very unique about the black experience in the U.S. which is encompassed in the types of environments in which black and white families live.
Another interesting observation in this book is the impact of incarceration. We saw America sort of go to this let's get tough on crime policy agenda in the 1990s. You write in the book that the way we incarcerate, the sheer numbers of people we're incarcerating, has the potential to do lasting damage, generational damage to the African American community at large.
Yeah, and it's a nuanced issue, I have to say. You know, as you mentioned, a lot of my work now is focusing on violence. There is pretty good evidence that the growth in incarceration, at least through the early 1990s, helped reduce crime. Okay, so if we're having an honest discussion about this, we have to acknowledge that evidence. At the same time, the rise of mass incarceration at this scale, which started way back in the 1970s, but really escalated in the 1990s again when violent crime was at its peak. You know, there was, in fact, a crisis in the 1990s of violence. It's not like it came out of nowhere. But this has destabilized communities. So when, you know, 1 out of 3 black Americans with less than a high school education will spend time in prison at some point in their life, and this is a scale of incarceration that's historically unprecedented, that is unprecedented across the world. And when you look at the spatial concentration of where this has happened, it means that the prison is a core institution in a lot of communities around Milwaukee and a lot of communities around the country. And there's a fundamental shift in the nature of urban poverty. Urban poverty is now linked with the prison system in a way that wasn't true decades ago, and it has had this impact of completely destabilizing families and communities. And we're just starting to understand the multi-generational consequences of this. There's some really good work. Chris Wilderman and Sarah Wakefield, they're 2 sociologists who study this and just have produced this really disturbing evidence on how incarceration of a parent affects the kids. And it's not entirely surprising, but it is scary. The impact on kids' psychological distress, the impact on the risk of homelessness, and several other outcomes. It makes me concerned about what we'll find in the next generation. What are the long-lasting consequences of this policy shift toward mass incarceration?
Milwaukee is sort of an interesting story. If you look at our metro area, you have the city of Milwaukee, which has some deep-rooted poverty issues. It's one of the poor American cities. But if you go outside of the Milwaukee area, you have pretty prosperous suburbs. In your book, you say that kind of extreme contrast does not bode well for a metro area. Why?
Right. Yeah, there's a big divide in a lot of places between central cities and their suburbs. It makes it difficult to carry out regional planning for transit, for housing. It creates a competitive environment where cities are competing against their suburbs when we know that cooperation produces more efficient outcomes for everyone. You know, so this is a fundamental problem. It also limits opportunities. You know, when the housing, when there's opposition to a regional transit system. I know that's a local issue that's come up over time. That's a signal that there's something more fundamental. There's a more fundamental disconnect, and you all know much more about that than I do in this particular context. But it's a natural way to limit economic opportunities for everyone across a metro area, and you can see that in Milwaukee. You can see that in Milwaukee's housing market. I know Matt Desmond was here recently. What he found in Milwaukee's rental market, that's derivative of the disconnect between central cities and suburbs, particularly in this area, but in a lot of places across the country, that really prohibits the kind of regional planning that we know is crucial to giving people economic opportunities outside of their own communities, to give people a chance for a more expansive set of possibilities in terms of the neighborhoods in which they live, for planning affordable housing. All of that is undermined by this type of competition between central cities and suburbs.
So how do we change it? I mean, if you have this generational, this legacy of disadvantage, I think you referred to it, how do we change it? Because it seems like there are maybe 2 or 3 potential answers, but at least one of them comes with some difficulties, and I'm talking about residential mobility. There have been these programs where you maybe offer housing vouchers and people can move from one neighborhood to another, and the feeling was that might change education outcomes, might change people's lives. You're a little skeptical of that approach. Why are you a bit skeptical?
Well, more generally, I think we have to have a set of principles in mind when we talk about urban policy. So the book makes the case that if we want to understand neighborhood inequality, we have to think about it in terms of multi-generational patterns. We have to think about it in terms of persistent advantage and disadvantage that's been passed down over time and across generations. So that has implications for understanding the impact of neighborhoods, but it also has implications for social policy. What it means is that we have to have a different time frame in mind when we think about urban policy. We can't have in mind programs that are going to provide a surge of funding into a neighborhood that's going to be gone in 3 years. We've had hundreds of those programs. A lot of them are great programs based on really good ideas. But if they're not sustained, then they have no chance to make transformative change in a neighborhood. And that's been kind of our pattern of urban policy. Really good ideas implemented with a lot of excitement and fanfare, and then diluted or abandoned a few years into the process. So what I argue here is that beyond the specific ideas, beyond the specific programs, we have to have a set of principles, what I call a durable urban policy agenda, if we want to have any chance of creating transformative, sustained change in the degree of neighborhood inequality. So you mentioned residential mobility. What I argue is that I don't argue for or against a residential mobility approach. What I argue is that if we're going to carry out a residential mobility program, then we have to set it up in a way that allows families to make a sustained change and to thrive in their new communities. So in practice, what that means is that we have models of programs. The Baltimore Mobility Program is probably the best example of a program that takes the position that, okay, we're not going to give families a voucher and let them navigate the private market on their own. Overwhelmingly, that reproduces patterns of inequality. People go where they know, where they're familiar. All of us do that. Instead, we're going to provide a program where we actually go out and seek out potential neighborhoods for families, seek out places where we think they can do well. Okay, provide them supports as they enter that new neighborhood. Figure out what the problems are in integrating into that community. Do they have transportation? Do they know which school their kids should go to? Can they get to and from their job during the day? And so this program is very unique. It was the result of a court-ordered desegregation case, and it was designed to provide the type of supports that would allow families to not only make moves across the Baltimore metro area, but also to sustain those moves. So this is kind of an example of what I have in mind when I talk about durable urban policy. It's not a specific program, it's not a specific policy, it's a set of principles. No matter what we do, we have to make sure that we reach multiple generations of families. Recognize that it's not just kids growing up in poor neighborhoods, that their parents also were overwhelmingly likely to grow up in poor neighborhoods themselves. So we have to reach both generations. We have to develop policies that have the potential to be sustained over time. So if the administration shifts, this program is going to stay in place, okay? If the business cycle shifts, this program is going to stay in place. Those are the types of policies that have the chance of creating transformative change, and we just haven't had that type of durable commitment to, particularly to low-income communities of color in the U.S.
It's interesting. We'll talk about this for a moment, because it's interesting. One of the programs that you cite in your book is a Milwaukee program, the New Hope Project.
Right.
Some of you in this room may remember that. It's in the mid-1990s.
Yeah.
It was the Norquist administration. David Reamer was really one of the guys who was behind this program. There were some indications that was an effective approach, but 4 years.
Lots of evidence for it. You know.
4 years is
Right.
how long it lasted.
Right. Yeah. That example is really frustrating for me, because I loved it when it came out. You know, this is a program that was targeted toward families in poor communities. So they're poor families. They had to meet an income threshold, but they also had to be living in relatively poor communities. So it was kind of a place-based, pseudo-place-based program. But everyone was eligible. All adults were eligible. A lot of our social programs are eligibility criteria focus only on families with children. Single men were also eligible for this program. There's great evidence behind it. There was a randomized study where eligible individuals were randomized to be in the program or not. And I know people have problems with that setup. But as a social scientist, I loved it. We could get a good answer about whether it works or not. And it worked. You know, the reason I describe it in the book is because it not only reached parents, but it reached their kids. When parents had work supports, so they were given subsidies. If they worked, they were also given guaranteed jobs if they couldn't find a job in the private market. And they were given other supports that allowed them to get to and from work. And what happened is their kids started doing better in school. You know, again, it's not a shock, but when the stress of everyday life declines, even to a slight degree, when parents are in a stable job, even if it's not a job in the private sector, if it's a temporary community job, their kids' lives stabilize. Kids started to do better in school, and there's great evidence behind it. So there are a lot of reasons why it fit the criteria of durable urban policy, but the time frame issue is one that's just repeated with so many social programs, that you have to maintain the excitement, you have to maintain the commitment of a program, and that's very hard to do. So I actually hadn't kept up with the progress of New Hope, but heard that it had kind of faded away, which is really, for me, it's very sad to hear.
When people, and Pat Sharkey's been in town now, he got in, was it yesterday? Or
Sunday night.
Sunday night. Yeah. He's had a very full schedule. He's had tours in
It's
Milwaukee.
been
He's
great.
talked to a lot of different people. We're going to continue that this afternoon after this event. So people probably are saying to you, so what do we do?
Yeah.
What should we do in Milwaukee? I mean, we have a legacy of disadvantage in parts of our community.
Right.
What do we do about it? You outlined a durable urban policy.
Yeah.
What do you tell the people who ask that question?
Yeah, well, I've kind of tried to tailor, you know, when you go to an individual city and you're talking to stakeholders within that city, a federal plan for a durable urban policy agenda isn't all that useful, right? So I've kind of tried to talk about what can be done at a more local level, and you all have a lot going on here. It's been really exciting to see and fun to hear what's been going on in the neighborhoods of Milwaukee. You know, I mentioned this focus on violence, and across the country, violent crime has been dropping for the past 20 years, and that was true in Milwaukee as well. And then last year, there was this surge of violence that hit the city. And so from my perspective, my first question that I've asked to everyone I've met is what happened last year in Milwaukee? Why did the number of homicides rise by 80 or whatever it was? I think 65 more than the year before. And no one has quite had a great answer for that. But I think the most pressing problem right now in a place like Milwaukee is how to kind of develop the core institutions that are the guardians, that are the overseers, that take ownership and responsibility over every community across Milwaukee. And I've seen some of these institutions in action. It's been really impressive. Susan Lloyd from the Zilber Family Foundation joined me in a tour around the city with John Gerda, which was incredible.
It's a good tour.
Yeah, no, it was fantastic. It was absolutely fantastic. I know more about Milwaukee than I do New York at this point, I think. But we saw, the neighborhoods across the city, and one of the things I was asking, well, in some neighborhoods you can see those core institutions that kind of take responsibility over that community, and then in other neighborhoods they're not quite there, or at least it's not quite clear who's in charge of a block, who's going to take responsibility and make sure that this public space doesn't go downhill, something happens with that abandoned lot, that the kids have a place to go after school. So this was a little bit vague because it's hard to create these institutions, but I think the first job is to account for every community across the city and figure out who is taking ownership over that community, who's going to make sure that community doesn't explode, that community doesn't go downhill, that the kids in that community are taking care of it. That's kind of a first order question, which is a really hard one, but I think that's fundamental to everything else.
You've got to have, what do you call them, community overseers,
Yeah.
but also what I guess we could call anchor institutions
Right.
or organizations.
Right.
That's what you're trying to identify.
Right, yeah, or sometimes the idea of the community quarterback is
Okay.
Some institution that is going to organize a plan for transformation of a community or stabilization of a community. And again, in certain neighborhoods, you can see what that institution is. But the larger point is it's not just about poverty, right? It's an interaction of poverty and then the vacuum without core institutions. That's what creates a space where violence can emerge. Okay, so even in a very poor community, if there are strong, stable institutions in that community, then overwhelmingly we have really good evidence that that community is not going to go downhill. Okay, if there are strong, stable institutions, then communities generally do okay, even if they're very poor communities. So it's not saying we shouldn't fight poverty, of course we should, but we should also make sure that in every neighborhood across the city, we know what that community quarterback is, and we can organize around that institution.
And now we're kind of into the violence part of
right,
the discussion here and the impact of crime. Another suggestion you have is this notion of precision policing. Mm-hmm. What does that mean in reality?
Well, people are doing this in reality, so I don't want to make this seem like it's my idea, but okay. The idea is basically, we've had a model of policing that's been in place for the last several decades that really grew out of a time when violence was a crisis, and it was a model that, to put it in very crude terms, police were kind of given free rein to do what they needed to do to control violence. And that model, as more and more people have kind of seen the consequences of that model, as it's become more visible to people like me who don't live in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods, there's more and more anger and more calls for changes to that model. That said, we have new models that are being developed, and I know they are known in Milwaukee as well. But the new models kind of start with the empirical observation that the problem of violence is a problem that is usually limited to a tiny fraction of residents within a community, and typically to a small fraction of places. So there are hot spots and there are hot people that account for an extraordinary amount of violence. There are a set of methods that have been developed to focus. I differ from a lot of my colleagues on this, so that, I understand that not everyone agrees with these policy stances, but I actually think police are absolutely fundamental to preserving and to overseeing community life and to preserving social order across urban communities. I think the way that they do it has to change, and so there are new models to focus. The broad idea is problem-oriented policing. Police working with community residents to figure out where the trouble spots are within their community, what is causing the problems in those trouble spots, and then to focus intensive resources on those particular trouble spots at the particular times when problems emerge. And then for the rest of the community, the goal for the police force should be to establish legitimacy. It should be to become a positive presence within the community. And that's a shift That's a shift in police practice that is going to take time to carry out. Police departments across the country have gotten that message. They understand it. There is change going on, but it's going to take a while to come to fruition.
Can you give us an example of a place around the country, a city that is sort of implementing this philosophy as you described it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I go back to New York because that's where I know, but...
You work for, is there like the New York City Crime Lab?
Yeah, so we have an organization called Crime Lab New York. It's an offshoot of, some of you may be familiar with Crime Lab in University of Chicago, which was, has had enormous success in working with the city and also with the Chicago Police Department. So we have an offshoot organization in New York, and what we've tried to do, we answer very precise questions about what's working and what's not and try to evaluate tweaks in policy. But really, there's a broader vision about kind of what's the next model of confronting the challenges that go with urban poverty. It's not just about policing. That's one dimension of it. But in relation to policing, there are several efforts in New York to change the nature of interactions between law enforcement and residents. They have specific officers who their job is not to enforce the law. It is to interact and get a feel for the neighborhood. And this is a major change in policy that's been implemented in New York because the explicit goal is for officers to play a different role within the community, to be a more positive social presence within the community. And this is happening in different parts of the country in different ways. It's a broad effort. I think police departments have gotten this message that policing has to shift, but that doesn't mean that we have to scale back policing. Police play a fundamental role in preserving social order, as I said, and in keeping communities safe. I just think the methods that have been used for the past 20 years have to shift.
So the work you're doing right now and a book that you're writing looks at how violence has declined in many urban centers around this country. And I think, as you correctly pointed out, that was true in Milwaukee for a period of years, and then we had last year, which I think left a lot of people, scratching their heads as to why. We've seen it in a few other communities, Chicago, homicide surge, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, St. Louis. There are a few of them out there. But that's not really the larger story. The larger story is violent crime is down in this country. And when it goes down, what happens to communities like the ones we've been talking about today?
Communities transform when violence declines. And so, this book is I'll admit, somewhat pessimistic, but the work that I'm doing now is incredibly hopeful and optimistic because there's been this fundamental change in the nature of city life that has taken place in most of the country. The level of violent crime has been cut in half since the early 1990s. And the early 1990s is when a lot of social policy affecting cities was really formed. Those were the last major debates about what's the next generation of urban policy, the period of welfare reform, the earned income tax credit. That all came out of the early 1990s. And since then, cities have really shifted. In some places, it's been more dramatic than others. But as talking with Mike, and in Milwaukee, if you looked at the numbers in Milwaukee in 2014, the number of homicides was less than half of what it used to be in the early 1990s. So this is not a fundamental shift in the nature of poverty in Milwaukee, but it is a shift. It means that the chaos that comes with violence has receded. It was no longer a crisis. Okay, and this is true across the country. Even in the places that remain violent, the degree of violence is nowhere near what it used to be in the early 1990s. Then some cities, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Fort Worth, Dallas, a few other places, have transformed completely. They're no longer the same cities. They have become safe, and city life has returned. Urban public life has returned in these places. So I think it's been a fundamental transformation of what urban poverty means in the United States, and that's why the book I'm writing is very hopeful. But then there are these anomalies. There are these questions like what happened last year in Milwaukee, and I've asked everyone I've talked to this question since I've been here, because I think this peace, I call it the era of urban peace, it's very fragile. okay? We've seen that it can go away very quickly. And if last year is a signal of something fundamental that has changed in Milwaukee, then I think that should be the #1 focus of everyone who's interested in the well-being of the residents of this city, to figure out what went on and to figure out how to make sure it ends.
You're a data guy. You're a statistician. Yes. You teach statistics. So I'm going to ask you to speculate on something that you don't have data to support yourself. But I mean, so why? Why Milwaukee? Why Baltimore? Why? I mean, I could make the argument, probably just sitting here, that a lot of people in this room could, and that is you have some pretty tough conditions in those cities. You have a lot of people living in poverty. You have a lot of hopelessness in the cities that we've been talking about, maybe more so than in some other communities. Yeah. Is that a wild observation on my part, or is that something that sounds somewhat reasonable?
Yeah, it is reasonable. We don't know. I think, there are theories out there. Probably the most well-known theory is that, after the unrest in Baltimore, after the unrest in Ferguson, Missouri, when police departments started getting more scrutiny, when there were protests across the country against police departments, there was a theory, not just that this affected police activity, but that it also affected resident activity, that kids around the country are seeing what happens, how law enforcement interacts with residents in different cities across the country. And you watch these videos, and it generates anger. It generates anger. When I watch the video of Eric Garner in New York, it generates anger. Okay, and so, this has been going on for a long time, but it hasn't been seen by everyone. It hasn't been seen by people living outside of the poorest neighborhoods across the country. Now it's being seen on a large scale. It's becoming better known. The types of interactions that are possible, they're not frequent, but they're possible in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods, interactions between law enforcement and residents. One thing we know is that police have to be seen as a legitimate force in their community in order to be effective. And you wonder whether the legitimacy of police departments has been undermined by some of the attention given to these incidents. Now, this is you're asking me to go well beyond the data, so we don't have the answer to your question, but that is certainly a speculative possibility.
Okay. I'm good at speculating. So at the end of the day, you're optimistic about a lot of what you see around the country. Should Milwaukeeans be optimistic? I mean, you've seen a bit of the city in the last 24 hours.
Yeah.
We have reason for optimism.
Absolutely.
Here?
There's great stuff going on here. There really is. I've been incredibly impressed, not just with the nonprofit sector, but with the way that the city government works with the nonprofit sector, with the commitment to the city. I look across the country, and the cities that really are worrisome are cities that don't have that set of stakeholders who love that city and who are committed to that city no matter what it looks like. Milwaukee's got that commitment. I've felt that, you feel that from the cab ride in, through every conversation you have. People love this city, and when you have that level of commitment and you have a well-functioning city government, you have smart people leading key agencies, then the city is in good shape. Doesn't mean that all those positive intentions won't be overwhelmed by other forces at work, but I've been impressed with every conversation I've had in Milwaukee. And it's just a thriving nonprofit sector in particular that is really kind of taking responsibility for entire communities. And you can see that, as we drove down the streets, you can see the signs of this with new community institutions that are that change the nature of the space. So I am very optimistic about cities across the country, with the caveat that there are worrisome signs in the past couple of years. In 5 or 6 cities, I think it's something real. And in Milwaukee, what happened last year, I worry that it's not just a blip, that it is something real. So again, that would be my target.
Yeah, I need to take a closer look at that, what's going on. Let's take some questions from the audience. If you're in the seating bowl, you know the routine, just press down on the rim, not on the little ball, but on the rim. And if you're in the back, Ryan has a microphone. Just raise your hand and he'll walk over to you so everyone can hear your question. So let's begin. We got lots of questions. I'm going to start right there. Yes.
Like Mike, I'll ask you to.
No, I'm actually starting right here.
Sorry.
Right there. We'll get to you. Go ahead.
Two things. I wondered if mental illness is any part of this rise in violence and how people interact with people who are mentally ill and out on the street and haven't got any place to go, that sort of thing. And the second thing was what you said in some ways is so discouraging, that something will be tried, but it will be tossed aside. Do you see that still happening? And is that a prediction?
Yeah, thanks.
Did everybody hear that question? Okay, let's start with the second part of it first.
Okay.
And I think she's getting at, we've seen a lot of programs that are trying for 3 or 4 years, and we sort of try them, and then we give up on them, and we move on to the next thing. That goes to your durable urban policy.
Right.
Are you optimistic that that might change at any time in the future?
I think that the signs of change that are encouraging have not come from the state, have not come from state or the federal government, but rather have come from the nonprofit sector. And that's where you've seen, you see it in Milwaukee with the Zilber Family Foundation, with the Building Neighborhood Capacity program, which is a government program. But you see organizations kind of planning for transformative change and making a long-term commitment to a community in ways that I think were not common 10, 15 years ago. It's becoming more common for the nonprofit sector to be developing long-term durable plans for neighborhood change. So that's very encouraging for me. At the federal level, I don't see signs of a new commitment, a new durable commitment to cities.
I'm just going to, I know you've got 2 questions, but I'm just going to try and, is that okay? All right. Let me go up here, this gentleman in the back, and then I'll get to you.
We have a mental health almost crisis and lack of mental health services in this county. And I'm wondering if you took a look at that, and are other cities having the same problem we have here?
Yeah, so this is good. This
is a follow-up on what she said.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know enough to answer confidently. What I can say is that the supports for mental health services generally in urban communities have been lacking for a long time. Now, whether there is a new crisis, whether that has shifted over time, I don't know. I'd be interested to hear whether that has happened in Milwaukee, whether there's been a change. But the general lack of supports and resources for mental illness has been a consistent problem in cities for a long time.
I'm going to kind of work my way across. Go ahead.
Yes, and this again, probably asking you to go beyond the data, but speculate. To what extent would you imagine there to be a parallel between the decline in really the disenchantment with integration on the part of both the white and black communities? I'm talking nationally too, races, and poverty stagnation and the decline.
Okay. Interesting question, thanks. When you look at racial segregation, it's actually been declining very, very gradually since 1980. And, in some places, like I look at the map of Milwaukee, and it's just stunning how segregated Milwaukee is. It's really, I used the term bizarre, and that offended someone, so I won't use that anymore. But I looked at the map of just where the racial and ethnic groups are concentrated in Milwaukee, and it's truly shocking. So you're at the epicenter of racial and ethnic segregation here. Across the country, particularly in Sunbelt, in the newer cities of the Sunbelt, it's less severe of a problem. A lot of times when there are more than two, when it's more than a black and white city, segregation starts to decline. I know the Hispanic population has really risen here. So that could potentially suggest a longer-term decline in racial segregation. But then the other key factor here is again, the distinction between the central city and the suburbs. When there's such a strong disconnect, when the housing, when suburban communities are consciously trying not to build affordable housing and are not trying to connect with the central city in transportation system, that just exacerbates segregation at a different level, not from neighborhood to neighborhood, but from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And that, that's destructive. That really is destructive, and that reinforces the kinds of divides that you're describing.
I'm going to go down here, and then I'll come back to that gentleman. Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things you talked about is the fact that the nonprofit sector is healthy, but why? I mean, why isn't it more like the business community? And to me, the fact that we have nonprofits that are working in central cities is a problem, because we should have businesses that can employ people the way it used to be. And so that sort of, to me, adds to the disconnect. And then also when you looked at the generational people who were in poverty, did you notice that those families sort of have this idea that they can't accomplish things because white people won't let them? And did you see that going through from generation to generation within those families, of why that was the case?
Yeah, so let me get at the first part of your question. The second question, I don't have the data on that. So I'm not equipped to answer that. It's a crucial question. I'm not the person to answer it though. We do have information on kind of attitudes and expectations for kids, but we don't have the evidence, at least in the data that I'm using, on the sources of that or the explanations of that. Does that make sense? On the first question, let me clarify. So you're wondering why there's a need for a nonprofit community to kind of fill in the gaps, and is your concern about kind of the change in the urban economy and the lack of jobs?
To a degree, yes.
Okay.
And also then it's like this whole group of nonprofit individuals have decided that they know what is best, or they're going to help in such a way in the black community, but they're still dictating what that is. So they bring the money, but they also bring the solution.
Interesting.
As opposed to letting the people in the community work on the solution. So
Yeah, okay. Great question. Again, I'm not the person to answer. But no, it's a really important question. So the way that, if you go to this model where philanthropists and foundations are driving neighborhood change, then you have the challenges that come with that, or the problems that come with that.
Because they pull the money if you don't do what they say.
The potential for change to be driven by a set of ideas about what's necessary, and how people should behave in order to earn that's there. So these are the drawbacks. You're exactly right to point to the drawbacks of relying on foundations and nonprofits to fill the gap that government programs don't provide, or to fill the gap when urban economies change and there just aren't enough jobs to allow people to support themselves and to support their own communities. So I think it's a really good question. It's an important question, and I think it's a question that we'll have to grapple with more and more as we start to rely more and more on that world in order to sustain community life.
Let me go back here. Ryan, if you can just...
Thank you. In the same way that there are historical legacies of disadvantagement, there are historical legacies of advantagement. And they seem to be interconnected. And in particular, I'm thinking about the ways in which, say, white privilege is oftentimes interconnected to the disadvantagement of racialized communities. That being said, is the kind of urban investment that you're talking about going to necessitate a disinvestment in those communities that are historically privileged and don't need any federal assistance in this way? I think you addressed it a little bit when you're talking about the competition between, say, Milwaukee and urban area or suburban areas. But I just want to push you on that question a little bit more.
Sure, yeah. So one of the things you said, that communities that don't need as much investment or federal investment, I want to challenge that point, because every community across the country relies on investment from the state to thrive. It's just that most communities take it for granted. And what I mean is our social policy is designed to support suburban communities. It's designed to support. Our largest housing program is the home mortgage interest deduction, okay? Combined with the property tax deduction, this is $100 billion a year. This is how we choose to spend our federal funding. We choose to spend our federal funding in ways that disproportionately go to the wealthiest homeowners in the wealthiest communities across the country. So this is our federal housing policy. That commitment, that's a durable policy commitment, okay? That commitment is taken for granted. It's taken for granted in the community in which I grew up, okay? It's taken for granted in many communities across the country. So you could frame what I'm saying as we don't necessarily need a massive new investment in low-income communities of color. We need to extend the commitment that's already taken for granted in most communities to the communities that have never received it, to the communities that have never been the beneficiaries of federal support on a large scale, such as the support that's taken for granted in most communities.
Other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Yes. Has any of your research looked at what the effect of a state legislature is on a city like Milwaukee? I'm familiar with Wisconsin. I don't know about New York, but there's a watchdog report started this Sunday in the Journal-Sentinel paper, and it's mentioned how the legislature has kind of tied our hands behind us in Milwaukee in getting rid of some of these problems. Have you found that in other areas?
Yeah, I've gotten this question a lot since I've been here. This is a key question here in Milwaukee. No, I've never experienced this, and never talked about this as much as I have in the past 2 days. It's really interesting. This is a problem here, clearly. When a city is pitted against its state legislature, I think there are, like I said, in the past 2 days, I've heard this come up in different domains. This seems to be extremely problematic. It's obviously present in different parts of the country, but the degree to which cities have clout in the state legislature varies so dramatically across the country. And I wouldn't be comfortable saying it's a general trend for cities. That said, if we want to think about urban policy going back to the 1970s, then this definitely has been a shift where the clout in state legislatures has moved away from central cities and into the suburbs, and that's definitely a part of the story about the waning federal commitment to cities.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a question? Yes, and then I'll go with
Did you find anything interesting or counterintuitive as to why people stay in homes and neighborhoods generation after generation, even when those neighborhoods have declined severely?
Yeah, really good question. Complex answer. So part of it is familiarity. Particularly when Black Americans moved into cities of the Northeast and Midwest, they had to fight to stay there, right? To build neighborhoods within those communities and to gain access to and basic civil rights in those communities. So there's a commitment to central city neighborhoods that I think is unique to the African American community because of the intense conflicts that took place in the 1960s, just for the right to live within cities of the Northeast and Midwest in particular. That said, I have done some work on this, on kind of what has changed, particularly as cities of the Northeast and Midwest started to decline in the 1970s and 1980s. And it's been very interesting. This is the first generation, this last generation is the first generation in the past 100 years in which Black Americans have been less likely to uproot, to leave their county, their state, their region than white Americans. It's always been the opposite. Black Americans are actually more likely to make longer distance, riskier moves than white Americans until this last generation, and then it's reversed. And again, I think, in order to really answer the question, you have to look at specific cities and kind of the commitment to those specific cities. But then there's another dimension to this, which is, I did a study that looked at what happens to young adults. So in the data set as a whole, in the nation as a whole, what I find is this incredible persistence of, so kids raised in poor neighborhoods overwhelmingly end up raising their own kids in similarly poor neighborhoods. And I was trying to figure out why that is. And so I focused specifically on kids who leave segregated poor neighborhoods when they leave the family home, when they grow up and move into adulthood and establish their own household, kids who choose to live in more integrated neighborhoods. And what I found is that over time, and I'm focusing on African Americans, over time, those kids started to live in more and more segregated neighborhoods. So the same persistence took place even among that group of young adults who chose to break out and move to a new place. What happened was not that they were choosing neighborhoods that were segregated, it's that those neighborhoods were changing around them. It's that as they moved into more integrated neighborhoods, those neighborhoods started to become more segregated over time, okay, particularly as the white population left those communities. So that's been a general pattern. Again, I'm generalizing to the nation as a whole. But the point is, if we want to understand the persistence of neighborhood advantage and disadvantage, it's partly about the choices that people make, but it's also partly about the choices that other people make, that neighbors make. And it's about this dynamic sequence of decisions that leads to, that reproduces segregation over time, most of which has been driven by the decisions of whites, okay? And that's a piece that, everyone has preferences to live with some members of their own racial or ethnic group. That's true for all groups. But if we want to understand the persistence of segregation, what we really have to focus on is the decision of whites.
One final question, yes.
Where do you see education fitting in the piece of this? Because, obviously, Milwaukee was a very blue-collar city. We had a lot of blue-collar jobs, a lot of things that didn't require higher education, and those are kind of, going the way of the wind. And not only that, but a lot of the inner-city schools aren't as functional as a lot of suburban schools for a variety of reasons. Where do you see education kind of fitting into, the segregation and poverty issue?
How does the education issue fit into the segregation and poverty issue?
It's a huge part of the issue. I think, as I was saying before, when I talk about neighborhoods, it's not just, the sidewalk in the street in front of your house. It's about everything that comes bundled up in space, and schools are probably the most visible and one of the most important, if not the most important institution, linking where people live with their outcomes later in life. So I think it's fundamental to the issue. I think the state of city schools, you're exactly right, that's been a huge part of the issue of why the neighborhood becomes so important. And every parent in the room knows this. You want to make sure you're in an environment where the default school is providing a quality learning environment for your kids. That's true for everyone. So it's absolutely fundamental to the issue. We know we have great evidence that if the same kid goes to a higher quality school, that kid will do much better later in life. So this is clear. This is a central part of the issue of urban inequality, particularly the issue of how neighborhoods affect kids.
We're going to wrap things up there. Before we go, I just want to say a couple things. I always like to thank everybody who comes to these events for your interest and your attention and your good questions. We greatly appreciate it here at the law school. The other thing I want to say is that this whole subject, inequality and the importance of neighborhoods and place in what we do in our lives has been sort of the focus of the past year here at the law school. We've had, I think, 3 of the leading sociologists in the country talking about some of these issues, Pat Sharkey being one of them, but also Rob Sampson from Harvard and Matt Desmond, also from Harvard. They've all been good enough to spend some time with us, and what I really would like to say to them is we really appreciate them immersing themselves in our community. Even if it's for 2 or 3 days, they really have a full agenda. They spend a lot of time here, and they offer some of their insights and thoughts. and share them with others, and we're grateful for that. So I would like to thank Professor Pat Sharkey again for being with us, and the name of the book, and you can find it, I did, it's still out there. It's got 3 years, on it, but it's still out there, Stuck in Place, Urban Neighborhoods, and the End of Progress Toward Racial Equality. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mike.